Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so excited today to be talking about the fantastic documentary film Rebel Hearts. We have Shawnee Isaac Smith, who is a producer on the film, and Pedro Kos, who is the director of the film. And Shawnee, I wanted to start with you because you've actually been working on this project for well over 20 years and first got to know these incredible women and interviewing them and touching base and starting to look at a lot of archival material even before Pedro jumped into the film. And I was interested in just over that time how you started to see the story shaping together, because there's so many potential different narrative threads and directions that you could have taken this story, especially when you have that many women. Any one of them could have been their own individual story as well. So I was just interested in the initial conception and then how the story really evolved over those 20 years.
Great question, because it was so difficult to choose who to put in the film. It was such a heart-wrenching thing to leave a lot on the cutting room floor. But I always saw it as a hero's journey. When I met these women, I thought, this is like a no-brainer. This is, you know, through three acts, hero's journey. They've done it, they've lived it, and they're continuing to live it. But one of the things that I always saw was that Karita's art would be a character. One of the challenges was these are older women, right? You don't want a bunch of talking heads. And even the associate producer who introduced me to these women, I would call her and say, who's that woman who was kind of the gray hair and kind of plain looking suit? She goes, you're not giving me a lot to go on here, So, they looked similar, and we wanted to really pick the personalities that really stood out. And then when Pedro came along, he had the same kind of vision. He did a sizzle reel. He had the same vision as far as livening it up and making it come alive with the color and the art. And then he added the animation. So it kind of took shape. That hero's journey kind of took shape, and Pedro was able to morph it into and create a more dynamic work of art, I think, from the
Yeah.
story.
And Pedro, as well as being a filmmaker, you have such extensive experience as an editor as well, which I thought was really interesting, particularly for a project like this, which isn't just going in and taking all of these interviews that Shawnee's already been doing, but so much archival material, animation, like she said. And so what are the ways in which, even during that initial continued development process and starting to put the film together, that you were thinking very much already about a lot of the post-production elements and how you were going to distill this down into a story that would work as kind of like, an hour and a half, hour, 40-minute piece on screen?
So it was really interesting because I was also when I met with Shawnee and Kira, and heard saw these extraordinary firsthand accounts and heard the story. It was actually a story I at that point I was not familiar with. When I came on board about 2015, and I was just sort of I was like, oh my God, how did I not know this? How and again, that classic hero's journey, but also something that was, I think, really sparked my imagination of like what these women did and kind of like what is possible, and like this meditation on change, and in a way that really kind of is very much in dialogue with what the moment we're going through today. So I always saw this as a story about today, about now, and wanted to actually bring the dialogue with the current moment. And at the same time, I always my goal is to always make a roller coaster ride, a really immersive experience as possible, and put the audience in the shoes of these women who lived through this and really stood their ground. So we had a saying in early on in the edit room is, what would Karita do, right? We were just so blown away by all of them, but Karita was a phenomenal teacher, and really taught their students to dig deeper, to think outside the box, and that was our code to think outside the box. How to create this immersive experience in a way that maybe we don't always think about. And so that was really an exercise that we did a lot. And we actually even wrote it in like little cards and put it up on the wall. Um, and that was, and as we immersed ourselves in the materials, you know, from these extraordinary interviews that Shawnee did, to all these different types of archival materials. And it's not just the amazing footage and films from, you know, the great filmmakers who were actually making films at that time at the Immaculate Heart College, like Bayless Glasscock, Thomas Conrad, Haskell Wexler, and others. But it's, you know, it was photographs, it was letters, it was questionnaires, it was all these different sorts of materials that in a way I think I wanted to embrace this cacophony of materials and feel like we're in them, you're journeying through, and in a way that kind of like shaped the approach to the graphics, the approach to the sound design. I kept saying, like, let's make it feel tactile. I want to feel the texture of that paper. I want to hear the sounds of the analog sounds. I want to, because it immerses you in a certain time and a certain moment. And so that was very sort of intentional. And even with the animation, how that evolved, you know, really kind of inspired by Carita's artwork and her process. And, you know, Judy Corin, our other amazing producer, really connected us to this Una Lorentzen, the animator, who is an Icelandic animator based in Montreal. And Una is extraordinary, and each frame of her animation feels like it's a separate, you know, like it's a serigraph, you know, with the different layers and how she brings in the different textures. And we incorporated the textures from the archival, the documents, into the animation. You know, each section has a different, you know, a different set of documents that's layered within those textures. So it is very much sort of like taking in sort of that layered process, you know, of making serigraphs into this, you know, filmmaking space, for the lack of a better word. So that was sort of the approach. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
It really does. And I especially loved exactly what you were saying, the way that the animation was, you know, so clearly inspired by her artwork. And taking that one step further, it also felt like her artwork really inspired a lot or enhanced a lot of how you told the film narratively, because, you know, as the film points out, you see the shift and change in her opinion and the way that she wanted to utilize her voice through her artwork over the years as well. And so for both of you, I was very interested in how her artwork and the evolution of the way that she told stories visually informed a lot of the ways in which you ended up shaping the narrative arc of the film.
You know, it's one of the extraordinary things about these sisters, and I'm kind of talking about in general, and I'll zero in on Carita, but because Carita is in a way an example. I mean, they all were really trying to be a part of the world, right? That was one of the things that they, and to be engaged in the movements of the time. Patrice going to Selma to march with Martin Luther King. Ruth Ann Murray and Lenore taking part in the farm workers' labor movement here in LA. They were all, you know, wanted to break down barriers between themselves and the world. And in a way, with Carita, this is also what she was, you know, many ways what she was doing. She was dialoguing with the movements of the time, with the anti-war movement, you know, the movement for women's rights, the civil rights movement. Actually, one little known fact is that one of Carita's prints was actually on Representative John Lewis's in John Lewis's office, was hanged on the wall in was hung on the wall in John Lewis's office. So one of the things is that they were really part of they were feeling very called by their spirit and their faith to, you know, try to make the world a more just place. And Carita, I want to definitely want to hear what Shawnee has to say, but you can see an evolution in what she's dialoguing as Ray Smith, the former director of the Creator Arts Center. You see, like in the beginning, it's more sort of like um, a more gentle, love thy neighbor, sort of message. Always very spiritual, but as the times evolved, as things became more necessary to be a little bit more strong in the message, Karita's message also evolved in that way. And so I think one of the things about using her Sargrass, which was always Shawnee and I both knew that we wanted for that to be a character, because it is dialoguing with the times, with those times that they're living in, and it's also dialoguing with the moment where we find ourselves in today, right? Where we're still continuing to push for a more just world, for more equal rights. So that was really one of the things that was very, not only it embeds you in the time, but it brings it also to the present.
I think when I interviewed Dan Berrigan, who was a priest activist with his brother Phil Berrigan, he actually said that he and his brother inspired Karita to speak out, but she said, I can only do it with my art. I can't go on the front lines like you do. This is the way I can do it. And at one point we put a chronology together for art, side by side with what was going on. And although Cardinal McIntyre had a little bit of paranoia and thought that she was speaking to him through his art, she actually was in a lot of ways, in a lot of the art. And we kind of tried to show that in a few ways, where we punctuated her art with, the reaction of the community to the patriarchy. So I think that's kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of the archival footage that you both sought out that is really striking throughout the film. And there's the moment with Karita where she realizes that she's not going to go back to the church, and she's being interviewed by someone, and she just can't even bring herself to say any words out loud. And I was very curious about, with the archival footage, because you were both working closely with the women throughout the journey of making this film, if it was something where you were independently looking for a lot of that footage and a lot of those moments, or if there were any moments of footage that they actually led you to.
They had quite a bit in their own archives. But when we brought on Gabriella Ricketts, who was our archivalist, she, found a lot of gold. And one of the challenges that I had and that Pedro and Gabriella found was that Cardinal McIntyre had a bit of a speech impediment. So he was very self-conscious about speaking in public. So there was very little footage of him anywhere. So we really had to dig deep for that. And he was also not a big theologian, so there weren't a lot of orations that he had in the archives either. Even the Archdiocese of Los Angeles didn't have any. So yeah, it was quite an adventure.
Yeah, these archival films take a long time because this dig can take quite a while, because you are literally following almost like crumbs to find where the treasures are, and sometimes it's, oh, it used to be with so-and-so, and then you go to so-and-so, no, I don't no longer have that. I gave it to, my former roommates, girlfriends, and it literally, you have to follow sort of a trail a lot of times. And, for some of them, like, thankfully, as Shawnee, began to compile a lot of things. For like that moment that you mentioned with Karita, that was actually Bayless Glasscock interviewing Karita after she left, and it's that emotion is so palpable in her that her silence speaks volumes, and so much more than words could ever say. And but for Cardinal McIntyre, there was only like really two pieces that we found of him speaking. One was his retirement interview, and then the other one was this speech that he gave here in Hollywood at the Palladium. But that was it, and you see those both in the film. And yeah, it was a challenge to find a lot of these, but we led by Gabriella, we had we were able to find some gems, which was really wonderful. Those are the most fun discoveries to make.
And one of the trails that always comes into play in documentary filmmaking for a project like this as well is the journey of your relationship with subjects as well. And, the women were very forthcoming and very open, it sounds like, but it sounds like there were also one or two other subjects that you ended up having interviews with that maybe weren't that willing to participate at the beginning. And so I wanted to ask about that in regards to what you felt shifted and changed, or even just the ongoing conversations that you continued having that then led to that change and turn of then saying yes to being part of the film.
It really took a lot of trust on the part of the women to open up, because they had been approached by other filmmakers prior to me approaching them. But the woman who introduced me, Lorene DeRocco, she had been a former member, and she introduced me and said, you can trust this person. So that was the beginning of it. And then I basically immersed myself in their community for over 10 years. I told them that I would film whatever they wanted me to film for their own archives, as well as their elders for their archives, even if I wasn't planning on using them in the film. So it was one of these things where I was just there a lot. The challenges were really getting the priests to speak up. The two that you see in the film, one of them I had approached several times, and finally, after Anita Caspary passed away, the Mother General, he agreed to be filmed, but that was after many, many years. And then some of the priests actually said they didn't want to be shipped to the Midwest for their retirement. So by telling what actually happened. So I got an interview from them, but I didn't get anything really that interesting. So those were challenges. And some of the priests who had in print said things prior during the 60s or 70s, they didn't want to say it again later. So there was those kind of politics involved. But the women, for the most part, were very forthcoming and really did want to have their story told, and I felt very honest. Pedro actually did some of the later interviews. What was your experience, Pedro?
The experience was overall that they were open, especially with Rosa and Patrice, and they were really, really excited and open to sharing their story. And with and with Sheila Briggs, Professor Sheila Briggs from USC, she was an extraordinary insight and was happy to share her knowledge of the subject. And so it was, I think, the trickiest ones were probably definitely the priests who are part of the patriarchy, the hierarchy of the church, because the church can be quite punitive. And we also interviewed, there was one of the sisters who actually stayed loyal. There was the few who stayed loyal once the split happened in 1970. And we interviewed two of them, and they were, I think they were happy to share their side of the story. I think there was an element of caution there as well, though.
And for both of you, in conducting a lot of these interviews, I was interested in what your stylistic approach is. How much of a specific roadmap do you want to go into these conversations having in terms of thinking about the overall structure and narrative of the film and some of the themes and topics, especially as you get further into doing a lot of the interviews and starting to get a sense of the stories that other people are going to tell and seeing if someone else has something to add to that. And so I was just interested for both of you in kind of what your roadmap was going into these conversations and the type of setup and environment you wanted to create for them.
Yeah, I think we both really had to do our research. We had to know the story inside and out and kind of anticipate what they may say. But there's always those those zingers and all the surprises that are the best, you know, or the emotion that comes out of that when you ask a question. Those are the jewels. So, but definitely I had ideas, and then at the end of the interviews, I always do what I call the Barbara Walters method, where I just say a few topics, you know, and just have them say whatever comes to mind, just to kind of throw them a curveball a little bit. And that was good because it added a lot of continuity that we could pull from later on in the editing room.
Absolutely. And it was a real, you know, gift to have these extraordinary interviews that that Shawnee did. And as she said, you gotta immerse yourself in the top. So, you know, research and, you know, bookmark and all that. This is Anita Caspery's book, Witness to Integrity. And really the story is also told here beautifully by her. And so, you know, you dive into this, and so by the time I came on board, I was, you know, I really immersed myself in the materials, familiarized myself with the story and things, you know. And really when I went out to get the interviews, I actually really, you know, knew what we, in a way, what we needed to cover in order to tell this, you know, this a cohesive story. And so that was, you know, and interviewing, you prepare a lot. For me, is you do a lot of preparation, a lot of research. You know, you create the flow of the questions, in a way to create a conversation out of it. And then, but when you get to that moment, it's I call it, it's like surfing. You know, you have all your preparation, but then you have to also be very present and you respond to you know, how the interviewee is reacting and what stories they're telling. Sometimes they are, you know, in their answer. A lot of times, like, you plan all the questions, but a lot of times they actually naturally go into other, you know, other answers to other questions. And so that kind of, you have to be ready for those to, you kind of surf and segue into different things. And sometimes they bring up new, you know, new unexpected the elements or pieces of information that you know you have to kind of dig in and find some more. So there's a lot of preparation, but also in the moment, really kind of be open and be present with what's being said, so that you can but always kind of keeping in mind, you know, sort of like what the overall story is and how this particular piece could fit into that overall puzzle.
Yeah. And you've both touched upon the fact that the film is obviously taking us into history, taking us all the way back to the 60s, but is also very much a film of now. And the number of topics and themes, you know, even when you were mentioning before, it touches on the civil rights movement, going all the way up to women's marches in the last few years, and the way that those have become more prominent as a part of society. And with the fact that you are telling a story and these women have been part of every single step throughout all of these decades, did you find that it was actually very organic in that the film became that, or was that something that was a very conscious setup from the beginning that you felt was really important to tell the story about these women, but to give the wider contextualization about, you know, what does it mean overall with organizations when there's a refusal to change, but a necessity to change to move with society?
I think that was always there. And I never ever saw the film as a religious film. I always saw it as a social movement feminist film. And one of the things in the editing room is a lot of times the editors were younger, and I said, but this is important. Women, a PhD back then was huge. I mean, a woman wasn't educated at all. So a lot of times we'd have to explain to some of the people editing, like, but women didn't have those rights back then. That's why this is even more important, because you can relate to what's happening now with women's rights, some of the same things, unfortunately, with the right to choose and all. But as far as just the basic rights that we take for granted as women, didn't happen back then. So that's what made these women even more extraordinary, because they embraced that, and they stood in their own power. So I thought it was, you know, they were just an amazing role model for women. And for me, that was always one of the major thrusts of the story I wanted to tell. Pedro and I were both, I was raised Catholic. Pedro's still a practicing Catholic. I call myself a recovering Catholic. So I had to like kind of learn a lot of stuff that wasn't taught in Catholic education, like the whole process that a woman goes through and gives up and marries Christ and all that. That was, for me, that was, I had no idea that occurred before we did the film. Pedro may be a little bit more tuned into that than I was, I think.
Well, it's funny. You know, one of the things we always think, you know, thank God we actually had, you know, non-Catholics on the team who could always kind of keep us in checks. Like, that's too inside baseball. Not, you know, Judy Corrin, who was actually Jewish, was, you know, provided a lot of that, and Kira as well. And so it was always important to maintain that perspective, because in a way it, you know, we want to sort of ask those deeper questions and larger societal questions. And one of the things that the story, you know, for me as a Catholic, but one who has a lot of issues with the institution, was the ability to see beyond the institution, right? And for us as a society, it's kind of seeing beyond these structures, you know, these structures that govern our lives, and ask the deeper questions. It's like, well, how do we fit in? And are these structures, you know, helping us? Or, you know, what do we need to do to, you know, improve them? Do we change them from within, or do we have to separate in order to create change? All these questions that they very much were grappling with back in the 1960s. It's something that we have to grapple with, our, you know, as well, not with the Catholic Church for most of us, but with, you know, with many institutions and structures that we deal with on a daily basis. So.
And then lastly, obviously, we were talking earlier about the length of time that it took to make this film. And to make any film is such a monumental uphill challenge and often takes several years. And, you know, the two of you both had such an involved process with this. But with that in mind, I wanted to ask you both about what do you feel are actually some of the aspects that ended up being a core part of the film that perhaps if the film had ended up being made and put out a few years earlier, may not have ended up being part of the story and part of the discovery of the process?
Well, for me, it was the whole idea that change takes time and that it's very incremental. It's a great story. It's, you know, David and Goliath. But for the long arc of the film, to really see that these women are still pretty much fighting for the same things we're fighting for now, but they're still doing it. So I think that's inspirational. We're in a society where we have so much instant gratification and need to see results right away, that it kind of gave me a point of reference for that, you know, keep fighting the good fight, and you can make change, and you can inspire other people in that way.
For me, I think it was really the thinking outside the box, and I think in many ways it was. It allowed the time, it allowed the film in a way to become, also as what Shawnee said, to become more current. Really, as we were editing last year, you know, the movements were, you know, for Black Lives Matter and social justice were really coming to the forefront. And we just felt it was it was dialoguing with our editorial process, which was really thrilling in a way, and also challenging. But one of the things that I think that the time helped was also to evolve the vision and to bring in elements like animation and to really dig deeper, to allow us to continue to dig deeper for materials and find the gems. I think that, you know, the process, a lot of this, it requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of perseverance in a way. very much inspired by these sisters who had to be very patient and to persevere with their goals and ideals. And this is only a fraction of what, this only a small fraction of what they experienced, but we also had to like keep digging and keep, was not an easy sell, like a film about, most of it takes place in the 1960s with Catholic nuns. So we just had to really kind of stand firm on our vision and our belief that this story was really worthwhile and getting out. And that strengthened our resolve, and that's, helped really shape the overall artistic vision that I think, eventually made it to the big screen. So I think it really matured and came into its own because of the time that it took.
Well, I am so glad that you both had that level of perseverance with what you were able to create with this film. And thank you so much to both of you for talking all about it today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mara.